So today we're diving into a set of sources that they define a core problem. And it's not really about intelligence, it's about timing. They ask this fundamental question: why do really smart people make these obvious, predictable errors? And I want to kick things off with a story, one sourced from your notes on executive failure. It describes the CEO who was, well, to put it frankly, he had an explosive personality. People walked on eggshells around him. And his employees, they knew, they absolutely knew, you do not bring this man upsetting news. But one afternoon, an emergency call comes through, and the CEO gets caught off guard. He just, boom, defaults straight to rage.
He was red-faced, screaming at the person on the other end of the line, telling them they needed to be put in their place.
Yeah.
But here's the real tragedy of it. The person on the phone wasn't trying to argue with him. They weren't trying to slight him at all. They were desperately trying to report a serious systemic problem that was about to, well, crater the entire company.
And because that absolutely vital information was met with just pure fury, the employee, what do? They just bypassed the CEO completely, went straight to the board. And the CEO was fired shortly after that. And not for the anger itself, but because his emotional default, his need to feel dominant, it prevented him from acting on critical data. His ego literally made him deaf.
That example it crystallizes the core conflict we're all facing, really. When true thinking should be happening, people are often completely unaware that their circumstances are actually thinking for them. They're surrendering control before their rational mind even has a chance to engage. There's a cognitive scientist, Cordelia Fine, who sums it up perfectly. She says, quote, "Never forget that your unconscious is smarter than you, faster than you, and more powerful than you. It may even control you."
Okay, let's unpack this. So our mission for this deep dive is to identify those specific moments when real conscious judgment is actually called for, and to understand the hidden biological defaults that hijack our minds and lead directly to these, costly, unforced errors.
And that all starts in that tiny fraction of a second, the space between a stimulus and our response. That's the space where you have a choice. You can consciously pause, apply some reason, and choose your next move. Or you can just cede control and execute a default biological behavior. And the tough reality is that the default behavior, it almost always makes things worse. Lashing out, assuming malice, escalating a conflict. Rationality is totally wasted if you don't know when the moment arrives that demands you use it.
And the costs of ceding that control are just immense. Think about a simple, super common scenario. A coworker kind of slights your project in a meeting. You feel that heat rise in your chest. You don't pause. You just instinctively hit back with some sharp comment that undermines their credibility. You didn't consciously decide that was the best strategy. You just reacted.
Exactly. And then what happens? The relationship suffers, the meeting derails into this personal conflict, and trust is just eroded. You've just consumed this enormous amount of psychological energy, not on achieving your goals, but on fixing the damage from your own unforced error. The person who learns how to spot these defaults and just pause, they ultimately direct far more of their effort toward constructive outcomes than the person who's just constantly cleaning up their own messes.
But why are we wired for this? Why this knee-jerk counterproductive reaction in the modern world?
Well, because the problem isn't usually our rational mind, it's our underlying biology. Our brain is fundamentally designed for survival and efficiency. We are programmed to act quickly in response to perceived threats without wasting time on these complex, slow thought processes. We are, at the end of the day, still animals. We share a lot of the same threat responses as our ancient ancestors.
Right, that makes total sense in a life or death situation, a lion attack or something. But how does that primal urge show up in the office?
Oh, it shows up in 3 critical, timeless tendencies that were, advantageous back in the Stone Age. First, we are biologically driven to defend territory. But that territory isn't just physical land anymore. It's psychological terrain, like your work status, your ownership over data, or your core beliefs. That's what fuels all those office turf wars and micromanagement. It's the fear that someone is invading your space.
Okay, and the second one?
Second, we instinctively organize the world into a hierarchy. We need to know who's in charge.
So that's why road rage exists. When someone cuts you off, your unconscious is just screaming, "Who are you to violate the order? You just implied you have a higher status than I do." And the office equivalent is when a rational disagreement just ends with, "Because I'm the boss, that's why." They've stopped thinking and just defaulted to reaffirming their rank.
Exactly. And third is just pure self-preservation. When the threat of layoffs or some big reorganization looms, you see otherwise thoughtful, decent people suddenly start hoarding information or shifting blame. Sometimes they don't even know they're doing it. They're just unconsciously throwing colleagues under the bus. The animal brain is triggered and it becomes them versus me. It's all about ensuring personal survival, no matter the relational cost.
So the conflict is crystal clear. These shortcuts, which were absolutely crucial for group survival 100,000 years ago, now they often act as anchors. They weaken our position and make things unnecessarily difficult in the modern world. Basic physical survival isn't really in question, but those primal defaults are still running the show.
And while there are dozens of these cognitive shortcuts, our sources highlight 4 core factory settings written deep into our DNA that tend to dictate our behavior unless we actively intervene. We call them the 4 defaults: emotion, ego, social, and inertia. These are the behavioral programs our brains execute automatically, and, just identifying them is the first step toward reclaiming control.
Let's start with the first, and I think maybe the most destructive one, the emotion default.
This is the tendency to respond to feelings rather than facts or reason or even our own long-term goals. We let our emotional state dictate where we put our attention and what we do next.
There is no clearer cultural illustration of this than in The Godfather. You have Vito Corleone, the patriarch. He's the absolute master of calculated discipline. He never reacts without thoroughly reasoning his path. But his son, Sonny, is the precise opposite. He's a prisoner of his quick fits of rage and his indiscretion.
Right. When a rival family pitches that dangerous drug deal to Vito, and Vito, calmly declines, Sonny immediately jumps in. He confirms he'd take the deal if he were in charge. His impulsivity just undermines his father and tells the enemy everything they need to know about the Corleone family's vulnerability. And that one indiscretion led directly to the assassination attempt on Vito. And later, Sonny's rage made him predictable, which led to his own brutal assassination at the Jones Beach Causeway. His temper just zeroed out all his strategic progress.
And that cost, it shows up even when you're focused on an internal state. Look at the story of the Olympian Matthew Emmons, a top competitive rifle shooter. He was poised to win his second gold medal. He takes aim, fires, bullseye, but he'd shot the wrong target. 0 points.
He missed a critical standard step, checking the target number. And when they asked him why, he admitted he was so focused on managing his emotional state, trying to calm himself down, manage the pressure, that he completely skipped the external fact check. The emotion default told him, focus inward, feel better, which made him blind to the objective reality.
We see this play out constantly in professional life. I mean, think about that former colleague who got into a massive escalating argument with their boss over an email chain about some quarterly numbers. In a fit of anger, he sent a series of sharp, disrespectful replies, saying things he, of course, immediately regretted.
And it cost him his job. Not because the numbers were right or wrong, but because the emotion default convinced him that winning that small argument in the moment, just getting the last word, was more important than preserving his entire professional future. That momentary satisfaction caused professional regret that lasted for years. The small feeling became the massive mistake.
So if you want to spot the emotion default in action, you have to look for the conditions that make you vulnerable, because they deplete your executive function. That means sleep deprivation, hunger, fatigue, being distracted, stress from feeling rushed, or even just being in an unfamiliar environment. These factors drain your capacity to pause and choose reason over reaction.
Which brings us neatly to our second default. If emotion blinds us to external facts, then the ego default blinds us to ourselves.
This is that tendency to react, sometimes violently, to anything that threatens our self-worth or competency or our position in a hierarchy. The ego demands that we look good and be right.
In The Godfather, Carlo Rizzi married into power, but his low status, relative to the Corleone hierarchy, it just festered. His wounded pride drove his desire to defend his self-image. He felt he should be a bigger deal. And that indignation led him to the ultimate betrayal. He wasn't plotting world domination. He was just trying to feel important.
And the modern parallel to that is just devastating. Unearned confidence. Hubris. We all know the type. The person who reads 2 articles on some complex social issue and then declares that the problem is easy to solve. Or the junior leader who claims expertise after a single weekend course. A little knowledge, intoxicated by ego, convinces us that low-chance events are zero-chance events.
And this ego, it often makes us care more about our perceived position than about actually extending our knowledge. This is why some leaders fail to empower others. They withhold knowledge or they micromanage because that dependency makes them feel indispensable and important. But they're sacrificing the organization's long-term health just for that short-term ego boost, which inevitably leads to collapse when they get overwhelmed.
You see this historically with General Benedict Arnold. He was a capable military officer, but he was incredibly sensitive to slights. His extravagant lifestyle and his attempts to earn respect led to massive debt and public reprimands. When his pride was wounded by just a light reprimand from George Washington, his resentment about his low social standing completely overpowered his loyalty and his judgment. And that's what led him to betray the U.S.
That need to protect the ego is so powerful that our desire to feel right often overpowers our desire to be right. I mean, when you find yourself in a disagreement, how much of your energy is spent trying to ensure you look superior rather than actually trying to understand the other person's perspective?
That immediately makes me think of the Mr. Rolex anecdote from the source material. The narrator was a 16-year-old grocery clerk, and he was dealing with this rude customer who made it clear he saw the clerk as beneath him. When the customer told him to hurry up, the clerk responded emotionally and lost his job. But the true cost wasn't just losing the job. Walking home, the newly unemployed student unconsciously spent all his mental energy rearranging the world so he could feel morally superior to this wealthy customer. He won the internal ethical argument, but he sacrificed his employment. We spend so much energy proving to ourselves and others that our moral positioning is correct, even when it directly sabotages our practical goals.
So if you're sensing that ego default running, you should look for these warning signs. Frequently wounded pride, difficulty admitting mistakes, claiming expertise after minimal study, or just expending tremendous energy on how you are seen by others. That's your ego fighting to protect its imagined status. Which leads us to the third factory setting, the social default.
This one is that deeply ingrained need to conform to the norms and expectations of our larger social group. We just want to fit in.
Precisely. As the journalist Walter Lippmann observed, "We're all think alike, no one thinks very much." Well, survival used to depend entirely on the tribes, so our individual interests became secondary to group harmony. And today, we still outsource our thoughts, our beliefs, and even our outcomes to the crowd.
I mean, think about being at a work event where a presentation is genuinely dull or, poorly argued. Others start clapping and you hesitate for a second, but then you join them anyway.
Right.
Because that biological instinct to fit in and avoid social friction, it immediately outweighs your desire to apply independent critical thought. The fear of being the one person sitting still is real.
And the cost of the crowd is a lack of critical dissent. If you rely on the group for your thinking, you're unlikely to challenge bad ideas from management or question processes that everyone just tacitly accepts. This is also why we sometimes fall into that illusion of virtue signaling. We claim we'd have behaved differently in some historical conflict, when the truth is the social default likely would have compelled us to just follow the path of least resistance, just like everyone else.
And as the sources remind us, lemmings rarely make history. If you continually do what everyone else does, you are guaranteed to get average results. I mean, think about the difference between the ditch digger who just works harder to dig deeper and the person who takes a week off to invent the shovel. The innovator looks like a fool until the payoff because they dare to deviate from the group norm. Success requires a degree of fearlessness and, shamelessness.
That's why Warren Buffett highlighted the danger of failing conventionally. He argued that, quote, "As a group, lemmings may have a rotten image, but no individual lemming has ever received bad press. It's safer for your career to fail on an average, accepted path than to succeed wildly on a path nobody else understood. The social default prioritizes safety over breakthrough."
Okay, finally, we arrive at the fourth default, the inertia default.
This is resistance to change. It's the psychological force that prefers ideas, processes, and environments that are familiar, even if they're suboptimal. Inertia literally means inertness or idleness. And as Newton's first law states, a body in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an external force.
We see this so clearly in financial decision-making. I remember reading about an investor who stayed way too long in a small restaurant chain position. The CEO's behavior was declining, but it was like a pot coming to a boil slow, hard to notice until it was too late. The investor had previous success and just kept explaining away each new transgression because the inertia kept them on the current path. Changing their mind, admitting they were wrong, it was just too difficult, and they almost lost a substantial amount of money.
Inertia keeps us in jobs we hate or relationships that don't make us happy because we know what to expect. Maintaining the status quo requires almost no effort, which is really the definition of complacency. We get attracted to what you could call the zone of average. It's too good to leave, but too bad to stay. The psychological cost of starting over is often perceived as greater than the discomfort of just continuing.
And that resistance, it often closes our minds, leading to that infamous doubling down. We resist changing a position when new facts emerge because the ego and inertia work together. We fear being labeled a flip-flopper. And this is true of groups, too. Organizations often value consistency over effectiveness, cementing ineffective processes simply because, well, they've been in place for 10 years.
We saw this on a massive scale historically with the decades-long resistance to banning leaded fuel. Alice Hamilton provided definitive evidence of lead exposure dangers way back in the 1910s. Yet, industrial inertia and corporate resistance kept car manufacturers producing leaded fuel until the U.S. finally banned it in the 1980s. Inertia keeps us doing things that don't get us what we want, and it's often hiding in plain sight.
So we've identified these four powerful defaults: emotion, ego, social, and inertia, that are running our brains like some kind of hidden software. If we can't eliminate them, can we really improve?
We can't eliminate them, no, but we can absolutely reprogram them. Our behaviors are essentially algorithms programmed by evolution, by culture, and by community. The good news is we can update that code. We can design systems where our biology works for us instead of against us.
Because willpower, it eventually fails. Look at the example of the parents who joined the armed forces and started smoking. They initially resisted the habit, but the daily grind just wore them down because everyone in the unit smoked. Decades later, they found that quitting wasn't about greater discipline. It was only possible when they completely changed their environment and found new social groups whose default behavior was the desired behavior.
That's the key insight right there. What looks like discipline is often just a carefully constructed environment. The way to significantly improve your outcomes is not by relying on brute willpower, which is a depletable resource, but by creating an intentional structure where the desired behavior becomes the default behavior. You join a book club to ensure you read more. You hire a trainer to ensure you exercise more. Your environment nudges you toward the best choices, overriding those old harmful defaults.
That is a profound perspective. The battle isn't about raw intelligence at all. It's about realizing when the biological defaults are firing and then choosing to pause and apply reason. We've covered emotion, ego, social, and inertia, and the need to spot them in those critical, ordinary moments of choice.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought, rooted in the words of the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. He said, "A man can do as he wills, but not will as he wills," and goal. If our environment dictates our behavior and we want better results, the question for you to consider is this. What comfort zone, what inertia default are you currently protecting that is preventing you from changing your structural environment to align with your long-term goals? Identify one area where you are relying on shaky willpower when you should be relying on a solid structural change. That choice is the true beginning of